Welcome to the channel. Today's colors: permanent yellow light, madder lake, ultramarine blue, burnt umber, titanium white, and Cobra's quick drying medium. These are all water mixable oils made by Royal Talents under their professional line called Cobra. The painting service today, once again, is an 11 by 14 rather. It has been previously stained by transparent red oxide. I use hog bristle brushes, numbers 8, 6, and 4, along with a couple of rounds, 2 and a 4, and also a liner, a number 2 liner, a palette knife, and once in a while a few fan brushes. This is a mixture of ultramarine blue and madder lake, which is similar to permanent alizarin crimson. And I'm taking a round brush. This is a number 2 round brush, and I'm sketching in the design for this painting. One thing that is so easy to do is to forget that you do not want to split the panel into equal halves. And you will see in just a minute, that's what I'm measuring here, and noticing that I did exactly that. So I'm going to be lowering that horizon line a little bit to make this painting work. Today's subject matter, I'm using a reference photo that I took of the Washington riverfront here in Missouri. So this is the Missouri River as it comes into Washington. We are looking out towards the west of Washington, Missouri, on the Missouri River. The reference photo was taken in the early fall, and it was one of the first days I can remember where we had a lot of fog. And I was really captivated by the lifting fog and thought that that would take and make a great painting. It also, the sun was reflecting on the water, making the water look bluer than normal. And it was just a nice color variety. So, and here I am sketching in the river bend that we see from the shoreline. On the one side, you will begin to see that there was a large tree. And so I'm going to sketch that in. That goes all the way up to the top. And there was also a smaller green shrub, which you see in the blob that I've put down. Remember, I'm just mapping it out at this point over towards the right end and a little bit closer to us. And so I'm just approximating where some of that foliage from the tree is going to go. Notice that in the sketch in, it does not have to be perfect. Obviously, it's just a map for where certain shapes are going to go. And I would say that that's one key here is learning to just deal with big shapes. Here I'm sketching in the cloud or fog formation that I saw on that day and that is contained in the reference photo. And with that completes pretty much the design for where I'm going with this. Today's focus of the painting, I'm going to be talking about the limited palette. As you noticed at the very beginning intro, I typically only use 5 colors. So for my yellow, it's a permanent yellow light. For the red, madder lake. For the blue, ultramarine blue. And then I add burnt umber, which helps me tone down some of the mixtures at times, and also provides a good base color for some of the earth tones and mixing those and shading and such. It can also produce a nice dark. And then, of course, titanium white. Here, once again, we start with the darkest darks first. And so the darkest dark today is a green shade that we see in the foliage. And so I'll begin applying that now. Once again, as I look at the reference photo and recall the experience of being there for a while, looking at this scene, I'm just sketching in briefly the darkest darks that I saw in that tree. The tree also serves as a composition element by keeping the viewer from wandering off of the page. And I also want to bring that same color in over on the other side of the painting. This also serves as a sort of bumper to keep the viewer into the painting and help them explore some of the other details that you will see later on. And now, since I have that color on my palette, I'm mixing in a little bit of titanium white to lighten that ever so slightly so that I can use this as a green that is in the background. And so this will help give us some depth. You always want to start with the mixture of titanium white just a little bit at a time until you get to the point where it makes sense with the tonal value. And so this is going to be a little bit lighter. I think you can see that well enough on the video. So that way it looks like this landmass is behind the darker forms and shapes I've already put. And keep in mind, that's what we're doing. Obviously, this doesn't look like anything right now. Just looking at the abstract shapes of the landscape. And so there is this bank from the other side of the Missouri River, and so that creates the river bend that's viewable from the Washington boat dock. And so that's what I have laid in there. Of course, I may have to adjust this later on, as you well know. Once you get all the colors in, that's really the only time at which you can really tell if you have missed the mark or hit your target in terms of the tonal values. So shoot for a middle value at first for each of your large shapes, and then modify later on once the entire canvas has been filled in with color. That will save you time and effort, because worrying about details in this early stage will only take away a lot of time and will often lead to a painting that looks very labored and, in my opinion, less interesting. What's interesting to me in paintings is bold brushwork, sort of confidence on the part of the artist who is laying down the colors, something that doesn't look very fussed over, but quite natural and easy. Here is a mixture of actually a dark black, but it's actually a dark purple, which is made with the madder lake and the ultramarine blue. There was a shadow extending from that tree, And so this is what I'm working on, along with a definitive shoreline that was also sort of in shade. So I'm going to use the same purple mixture for that as well. Of course, at this point, I should notice that there is always a danger especially among beginning painters, to want to paint all shadows a purple. So keep in mind that all shadows are not purple, and you can certainly make other shadows with different dark colors. Another mixture that you could use would be to use the burnt umber on my limited palette with the ultramarine blue. And that will also give you a dark, but that particular dark will not be towards the purple family, but rather to the brown family. Or any brown, by the way, would be considered an orange. Here I'm just scraping off the palette, reminding you that it can be helpful once you're done with putting the darks down on the canvas to clean it up, so that way you can make sure it's good and clean for your lighter lights. So then I'll take a shop towel and wipe off that palette. Here you can see I've put what I consider to be the darkest darks down already. And I did put a couple extra greens in there because it was already on my palette, so it was easy to utilize that color by simply mixing in a little bit of titanium white after I had put in the darkest greens. Now I'm dipping into my titanium white, adding just slightly a little bit of ultramarine blue as I work at getting a sky color. I know my hand's in the way, but there you can see it a little bit. It's just a matter of adding a little bit at a time. One mistake you can make, and I certainly did when I was starting out, is thinking that you needed a lot of color in that titanium white to change the pigment color, but you really do not. So start very little bit of color into the titanium white, and that way it's easier to darken that. Once you've gone overboard with making it too dark, of course, then it becomes nearly impossible. Here we go, putting down a variety of strokes. And you'll notice on the thumbnail that you probably looked at as you decided to watch this video, it certainly didn't look anything like this. And that's the important thing to realize, is that you've got to suspend your judgment, focus on laying down colors and covering the landscape. The details will come later. And I think that this method can help the beginning painter realize that you don't have to get too fussy. And if you're not in too big of a hurry to make things look more realistic, you'll get there. You'll get there. Of course, I must admit that there are times in which I want my paintings to look more painterly rather than real life, if that makes sense. I want people to be attracted to the work on the basis of the composition, the color, the edge work, the bold brush work, and so forth. Now here I've added a little bit more ultramarine blue, not a whole lot, but a little, and that way normally as you go up in the sky, as you're looking up in the sky, you will notice that the blue color becomes more saturated. So I'm laying some of those pieces of color in. And thinking about how I might come back in then to blend those two blues together, so that way your eye does not see any kind of bold edge. Obviously, when you're looking at the landscape, you do not see a bold line, or at least normally you don't. Perhaps in a storm or something, you might see more of an edge with the clouds and so forth. But certainly on this day, that's not the case. And as you can tell, I'm following my roadmap that I established with the sketch. Now, some artists will take a little sketchbook with them and do a little thumbnail sketch, just a little pencil drawing, and then transfer the pencil drawing to the painting surface. And you certainly can do that. I tend to just do it right on the panel, especially if I'm outdoors. It saves me a little time. You've only got about 2.5 hours or so before the light's going to change, and so it can be very handy to learn how to paint as quickly as possible, so that way you can capture what you are seeing. Now I'm adding a little bit of permanent yellow light, and you're wondering, what on earth are you doing? You're certainly not going to use that in the sky, are you? Actually, no. What I'm looking at now is the river color. And since I had that pool of color already on my palette, now becomes a perfect time to lay that color in to the water. So you'll begin seeing that. And normally a good practice for coloring water is to always pull your brush strokes downward. There, you see that? That will give the illusion of water, because water, after all, is simply a reflection of the sky and other surrounding elements. And so pulling it down like this will help give the illusion of water. There's a little bank out there, and so that's why we see the sketch markings that you see, that the dark little section that divides the waters. So, but you'll see me put in other water surrounding that here shortly. Here I'm just increasing the intensity of the blue. Sometimes it helps to get up, to walk away and take a look at it from a distance of your painting. And so that's what I was doing here. Especially if you're sitting down painting and you're right on top of your canvas, it's always important to back up and take a look, because your viewer is not going to be looking at the painting, or at least hopefully not with their nose sticking on the canvas. They're going to be viewing it from a distance, and so from hanging on the wall or most likely. So keep that in mind, that we want to make sure that it looks good from a distance. And now I'm taking that blue and I'm going to start finishing off the water section. Wanted to get a little bit different color variation from what I put in already, since this is water that's sitting back a little bit. And here I also noticed that the horizon line is still not quite right. And pretty soon I will make some corrections to take that line down a little bit, so that it's not as centered as it is now. Because that's, as we mentioned before, that you don't want to split painting in half necessarily, because it tends not to work well compositionally. The viewer may actually read it as two paintings instead of one, because of it being smack dab in the middle. But hopefully I've avoided that with a couple of later attempts to fix it. Now you can tell that I'm starting to measure with my paintbrush where that horizon line hits on each side, and trying to begin thinking through the decision of how I'm going to fix this mistake, because obviously it's too in the middle on one side, and it's also up a little bit more on one side than the other. So in this case, the solution I came up with was simply to bring the sky color down a little bit more on the one side of the painting and into the river water, if you will, and cut back on that river water. So here I'm wiping the paintbrush. And that's something we could discuss too. Since I'm using a limited palette, I actually want some of the other mixtures to be in the bristles once in a while. Now, oftentimes I will have 1 or 2 brushes dedicated to the darks and 1 or 2 brushes that are dedicated more toward the lights. And that can also help to keep the brushes from becoming too dirty. By dirty, I mean saturated with intense paint. Now here, after I've cleaned that off, I'm going back in and basically blending those 2 blues together and varying my brush strokes to hopefully create the illusion of perhaps some distant clouds, or at least some variations of that blue. Now, after I've wiped most of the blue out, but not all of it, I'll be adding some titanium white and working into the cloud shapes. I think that's next, if I remember right. So you see the titanium white, and then I'm taking just a little bit of blue to take that down a notch. I don't want it so white it won't read very well. It'll cool the painting too much because titanium is such a cool or cold color in comparison to the others. Okay, so first I decided to go ahead and fix that horizon line because it's kind of on a little bit of a slope. I don't know if you can tell it here. And so I'm cutting back into it as a way to fix this. And that might be an important thing to mention, is that as you're painting, there will be times in which you make mistakes. And part of the painting process is figuring out what to do about those mistakes. How do you go about fixing those mistakes? And so here in this portion, the fix is going ahead and repainting that horizon line and setting it a little bit lower. And coming back in on top of that with a little bit of a lighter sky color. And here we go again. As I run that titanium white predominantly across that middle. And notice how the sky blends almost into the river color. And of course, in the reference photo, that's quite accurate because we're dealing with the subject of fog. And so this was the best fix I could do, is to actually use it in the painting to help me to create the fog effect. And now I'm coming back in with basically titanium white mixed with a little bit of ultramarine blue and actually a little bit of the permanent yellow light as well. It's kind of a greenish gray is what I'm shooting for as kind of a base medium color for the clouds right now. And there you can kind of see that. And with the transparent red oxide as an underline underpainting, I'm going to play with that a little bit and allow a little bit of that orange to kind of show through the clouds. Because on this particular day, that's exactly what happened. Of course, the sun was rising from the other side, so this is front lit. This landscape is front lit, and so you could see a little bit of a warm light being reflected off of the fog and the clouds there. So in order to help that, I'm allowing some of the underpainting to show through. You'll see just a tad of an orangey color coming through this large cloud shape here. And once again, as I'm painting this, I'm thinking about the abstract shape. I'm not really thinking about painting clouds yet. And once I get everything down, I'll have this is still oil paint, and so it's going to be wet for a while, so I can come back in and change it up some. But I don't need to get too fussy right now with it. I will simply wait until I get everything on the painting. And of course, I'm also painting relatively light. These are not thick strokes yet. I am adding some quick dry medium, because titanium white I've often found is the last color to dry on a painting, and so I particularly go heavy with the quick dry medium when I want that in the painting. So, and hopefully that looks like some clouds mixing with some fog at this point in the painting. So I was quite pleased with how that section of the painting turned out at this point. And so now I'm just taking some of those clouds that I see and stretching them across the river bend area. And here, I'm just ever so lightly pulling that through the landmass that I painted. And notice how that suggests a little bit of fog being seen over and against the landmass. So I didn't want too much, but just a little bit. And notice how the mind and the eyes read that as fog and clouds swooping down and creating a little bit of mystery in terms of the landmass that is behind it. There was a little bit of variation, an aqua type of blue that you could see in one area of the fog and clouds. And so at this point, I'm attempting to mix that mixture, which is closer relative to the watercolor than it is to the larger sky. And so finally I was able to get something close to that, and you see I'm cutting back into the cloud shape with it now. And this was clearly evident in the reference photo and in my memory, and created a little bit more interest in the sky. And so I'm putting that in at this point. At this juncture, may I remind you that if you're enjoying the content, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. And of course, give a thumbs up if you would. If you have questions or ideas for other videos, please, by all means, drop them down in the comments. A little bit of information about me. I didn't start painting until I was close to 50 years old. So if you are an older painter, hopefully I can inspire you to keep at it. I was terrible with painting earlier on in life. I took an art class in high school, an art class in college, but I didn't take them too seriously, honestly. They were more of electives. I had to have elective hours in college and also in high school, and so I thought that painting would be easy, and didn't really gravitate towards painting at that point in my life. Later on, I began what my wife had encouraged me to do was that maybe I was spending way too much time working, and what was I going to do after I retired one day if it wasn't work? And she said, anyone can paint. And I told her at that point, have you seen me paint? I think you know that I probably can't paint. So I almost started as a dare that, no, I really can't paint, hon. And let me show you that I can't paint. And for a while, I really struggled. I started with acrylics, and that was a challenge. I really thought that acrylics were supposed to be healthier, easier to work with. And what I ended up discovering was that actually they were much harder to work with because the dry time is so short that you really have to know what you're doing in order to get it down. And the end result I always felt looked a little too plasticky, if you will, because that's what it is. Acrylic paint is just basically turns to plastic. Then I began looking into oils. Began looking at abstract painting to begin with because I was convinced that I couldn't draw, and therefore it would be a nightmare to try to do something realistic. And so I thought, well, it's got to be easy. Look at how easy those abstract paintings in the museum look. One thing I also discovered was that far from it, abstract paintings are actually a lot of work, perhaps even more so than landscape or portraiture, because the only thing you're trying to do is to put colors on top of colors and provide interest in a non-representational way, and that's actually quite difficult to do. All right, so at this point you can tell that I've been using some burnt umber and some titanium white to produce this little landmass that's actually in the river, covered up when the water depth is higher, but on this particular day it was certainly showing. And so now I'm going back in with a little bit darker mixture of burnt umber and a little bit of madder lake to give it kind of a reddish feel, and then painting it into that landmass. And tricky part there, because it's very, very close to the dark green that's in this foliage that's right by the shoreline. But as I continue to paint and get closer to the foreground, I'll be mixing up some lighter colors. So we'll take care of that in a minute. Now here, there's actually some land that you can see stretching towards the river there, creating the river bend. And so there I painted that in, and I think that helps to establish the horizon line as well as to take the viewer down that path so that you're kind of coming in from the dark shadows under the tree, and then naturally with this landmass that's in the river itself, and then the shoreline whips you kind of around and then takes you to look at the fog and the clouds and the landmass on the right side of the painting, so that you're kind of going in an S pattern, if you will, in terms of the composition. Here I'm producing with that burnt umber mixture that's already on the palette. I'm now painting in some titanium white, so I get a little bit lighter shade of brown. And this is the color that I see on the river shoreline at this point. And so that's going to be the next focus. Now, underneath the tree, you'll notice that it's pretty much just a glob of purple at this point. But what I'm going to do now is establish a few little specks where sun is coming through the leaves on the top, and so that you get a kind of speckled effect. Now here I'm just establishing that shoreline and the barrenness of that land there, most likely from travel, people coming. I believe there's a little bit of a trail ahead there that people can get out of their cars and walk down there a little bit to take in the view. There's a boat ramp and a city park in this area. So now here I'm just kind of taking this and putting it over top of that underpainting, which was that purplish transparent red oxide. And I want a little bit more realistic color down here. So, and I think as I'm putting it down, that is indefinitely creating some interest and looks more realistic and in line with the other colors that I've already laid down. Notice that this limited palette helps with the harmony. All these colors are going to work together because all I'm doing basically is using one of each of the primaries along with burnt umber to help tone down some of the saturated color. And so almost every mixture that I've made has had a little bit of each of the primaries. Here then, you see it just applying little brush strokes to indicate where the sun is peeking through the foliage of the tree and creating some light spots on the ground below. That's what those are. And that should become more obvious as the painting progresses. And right now I haven't even touched the tree yet. So, and trying to vary the brush strokes again, pulling the color down. And notice once again, if you've been following around, I think you would agree that this is not a real difficult landscape to paint. You can certainly do something similar to this. And notice how it really does simplify the process just having a few colors. And so if you're a beginning painter especially, or even someone who's been painting a long time but maybe struggling, simplify your palette. You have less choices to make. Obviously, if you're going to paint blue, you've only got one blue to start with. If you're painting yellow, you only got one yellow to start with, and red. And then, of course, you know how to. You'll learn how to mix just about any shade you need to by practicing with this very limited palette. In fact, I think it's much more difficult to paint with lots of different color tubes. When you are using too many color tubes, and your paintings can lose that sense of harmony and become more cartoonish, if you will. And of course, you got to remember that the paint manufacturers, they obviously want you to paint and buy as many colors as possible, but you can get almost anywhere with the palette that I'm using right now. When I first started out, I too bought a lot of different tubes that I really didn't need, and so over these years I've figured out which ones are really necessary, and it saves me a lot of time and money by not purchasing every tube in the store. Now here, what I did was I just took a little bit of the burnt umber and a little bit of the Madder Lake, and now that produces a little bit of variety in this this beach, if you will, of the river. so that way it provides a little bit of variety. Whenever you see just kind of a solid color, you kind of need to have a little bit of interest in there by adding something else. If it's a different color, that can work, or a darker color. It just needs to be the same tonal value. And you can tell that by squinting. And then if the colors kind of merge together as you're squinting, that's a good sign that you have gotten the tonal value correct. If you squint and you still see the distinct shapes and colors that you put down, then it's most likely not the same tonal value, and you need to adjust it some. Now I'm going back in with my lighter color to give that sense. You know how if it's kind of a sandy ground that you there are places that are going to be lighter, places that are a little bit darker due to how the sun's shining and the depth of the sand or the ground that's in that spot. So that's what's happening there, or at least I'm attempting to do. Now, I think that looks pretty realistic. What about you? And yet, at the same time, notice how simple it was. I'm really not mixing a terrible number of colors here. And whenever you're painting nature, you discern that the color shifts are very subtle shifts, really. You're not needing to mix any wild colors, and so therefore you don't need a bunch of wild colors on your palette. Once in a while I'll add what we call power colors in case there would be something that I can't reach with this palette. 2 extra colors that you might want small tubes of because you won't be using them too often. If you're using the water mixables, then I would look at phthalo blue, which can give you some wonderful greens and higher strength greens and blues, etc. And then either a cad red light, or I've also found a substitute that I think works pretty good for that if you don't want to use cadmiums because of the metal in that paint. But folks have used those for centuries. You shouldn't worry too much about the cadmium in it. I don't think that's a big concern. But you could also try pyrrole red. And I've noted that several professional artists are turning to that as their only red on the palette, in fact. And for some paintings, I will switch out Madder Lake for the pyrrole red, which is similar to cad red light in my book, but a little bit towards the blue side as opposed to the yellow side of that mixture. So now here, once again, I've now mixed a lighter green, so I'm coming back in over top. This was just kind of like a little bush or something foliage-wise that was right here. And it serves for the composition. Everything needs to have its reason for existence here. So this is to give it a little bit more detail. The eye will mix this, trying to vary the brush strokes, and I'll work out that a little bit more later. But this actually kind of keeps you from going off the edge of the painting, even though it's not right on the edge. It does help to keep you focused. And then also the fact that, notice, it's going up in the direction of that landmass where the fog is. So that's another visual clue that I want you to look up there. After you've seen the bush here, I want you to explore that landmass, and then you could almost come back around to the river bend and then back over to the larger and darker tree element in the left side of the painting. So therefore kind of completing the S or the of the composition so that you're led in and around and hopefully remain in the painting for a while to enjoy the different parts of it, both the foreground and the distance and even the clouds. Now, certainly that light green doesn't look quite like a plant yet, but once again, I hold off on too much detail. Now I'm taking that same color and I am now applying it for the tree. And notice that I'm not painting individual leaves here. I'm just kind of focusing on creating some interesting shapes that I will further develop to look like branches coming out with leaves, but not necessarily individual leaves, but masses of leaves is what we're trying to focus on. And so I'm also trying to cover up all the the light shades that don't make any sense at this point. And so you see me, or the underpainting that's still shining through. So I'm going to paint over top of all of those. Also varying the brush stroke. This is, like I said, I think I used about 2 brushes at this point. One for my lights, one for my darks, 1 an 8, 1 a 6, if you're keeping track. Of course, the sizes can vary by manufacturer, so keep that in mind that an 8 by 1 manufacturer may not be the same as an 8 from something else, or a 6, etc. So oftentimes what I've learned from others is that you should try to use a larger brush than you think is needed, a larger brush than you're kind of comfortable with. And what that will do is force you to paint a little bit looser and with less detail, because nothing kills painting like trying to do too much detail. Notice there's hardly any detail in this painting. I didn't get out a little bitty brush and paint anything yet. And or one way to think about it is withhold using a small brush as long as you possibly can, until you virtually have the entire canvas covered and you've applied all your major shapes, and then all you're doing is adding a few little highlights with maybe a round brush or a liner brush. And that's kind of my process, is that I will not use a liner brush or a rigger brush that can make little detailed lines until the very end, and I won't, except for the initial sketch, I'll leave the small rounds alone. Now here is a number 2 fan brush, and so now I'm going to start to create the illusion of detail by taking some of those kind of unrefined shapes. And just with this is a dry brush technique, so I didn't put anything on this fan brush. I'm just using the paint that was already there on the canvas and just kind of pulling it up and creating the illusion of maybe some twigs, some leaves coming up from this particular spot on the river. And of course, once again, the compositional element to pull your eye up towards the fog, towards those clouds, towards that landmass that's covered in some clouds at this point. And now I take my attention over to the larger tree, and we're not going to worry about painting particular leaves. So how do we get the illusion of it? Well, you take the hard edges that we had just painted and we soften them. See how I'm softening those so that it hopefully will look like just a kind of a mass of perhaps leaves, and then working it down a little bit as we go. I'm not applying very much pressure, by the way. If you're thinking, well, how hard do you press to make this effect work? I'm barely touching the paint. There's enough paint on there that it moves it just ever so slightly, and I don't want to ruin or kind of erase the paint. And what happens is if you apply too much pressure doing that in this dry brush technique, you'll kind of erase what's underneath it. So I don't want to erase that. And now I've cleaned off the brush entirely with some water, and I'm going to soften these clouds a bit to produce a little bit more realism, I think, or at least that's the hope. Clouds don't have hard edges, at least not in nature. Maybe in a painterly painting, but this is a little bit more realistic. So and I think that achieves it. See how that softens that. Sometimes I struggle with that. Of course, every painting you're going to struggle because every decision you make is going to change the outcome. So, like here, deciding to use a fan brush means that it's not going to look a certain way because I used a fan brush. If I had left it with a flat brush, then that would have made it look a little different as in terms of a painting. So, and I don't know about you, but I enjoy looking at different skies and different techniques on how to achieve a certain effect. And so I encourage you to experiment that way. You may not want to do any blending whatsoever in certain paintings and see what you think of that technique. The strokes will be bolder that way. They may be a little bit less realistic, but they can oftentimes be very expressive and have a real emotional value. Okay, now I'm making a darker green, as you can tell by the introduction of some ultramarine blue already into the mix of green I have on the palette. I'm adding, of course, a little bit of each of those colors. A little bit of the red, which is the Madder Lake, and a little bit more of the permanent yellow light. Because that's all we got. And this is creating a kind of an olive green, if you will. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take one of the round brushes I have and create even more realism by just introducing a few detail strokes. So I'm dipping this into my quick dry medium as well as the water, getting this olive green on my brush. And since the leaves on the big tree are light, watch what happens. There we go. So this introduced some contrast into those branches where we would normally see some shadows in the tree as opposed to the light coming through it. So we want the illusion of little leaves and branches and other foliage and how the light is affecting them. And trying to vary the strokes a little bit. I don't want everything to look the same, of course. I want it to look rather natural. And I'm just going to continue to play with that a little bit until I get kind of the effect that I want. But notice I'm in no way painting every single leaf. I'm just giving the illusion of detail by putting some of these marks in. And it also provides more interest as I'm doing that. And you be the judge, but hopefully your mind is telling you, yes, that's a tree now. It doesn't look like something else. And now I'm taking a few of those strokes because when you use any color, you want to use it more than in just one particular spot in the painting. This produces, once again, the sense of harmony throughout the painting. And so I'm using that darker green now to suggest that there's some grass and some little plants that are growing along the edge of this little landing area, which actually sits up a little bit further from the river. Once again, doesn't that look pretty realistic, I think? And yet you just saw me paint it. Wasn't that hard to produce a very realistic looking scene using a limited palette, just the primary colors plus burnt umber and titanium white, and then varying our brush strokes and the way that we make marks on the painting, and how we squint to see the tonal values and making sure that we push back certain land masses, etc. So now I'm going to be signing the painting. Reminder to, if you'd like this channel, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe. Thank you so much for watching today's broadcast, and I'll see you again in the next painting.